After a particularly bad tax season, Nick felt more than a little justified requesting a couple days off. His boss didn't agree. What Nick had originally planned as a week of R&R became a slightly longer lunch break on Friday and the weekend off. Now that things were returning to normal, he would have had the weekend to himself anyway. It wasn't all bad, though. He'd practically lived in his office for the last month. It was the only way he'd been able to keep up with the workload prior to the deadline. Once, near the start of the season, he'd asked one of the senior accountants if it would really be that bad if they were a little late filing the returns. Nick had meant it as a joke. Unfortunately, when the managing partner found out, he didn't take it that way. Nick shook his head. As bad as tax season was, dealing with an incest partner on a righteous streak was worse. The best he could hope for was to avoid another boring tirade that carried with it the not-so-subtle threat of being fired. He had to look on the bright side. For the next 2 days, he could disappear off the face of the planet, and nobody would care. He was free to do whatever he wanted, no questions asked, no not-so-subtle comments about time being wasted, no explaining to the client why rounding off a zero off their total income for the year was a bad idea, and no more phone calls that began with, "We need you to redo the Johnson returns. They just had a sudden change of conscience and disclosed everything they were hiding in the Caymans for the last decade." No. A weekend off was more than enough after the corporate hell he'd been through, even if he didn't believe the sieve-tight justification for a second. Work ended and Nick left right away. He didn't want to risk getting roped into one of the partner's special projects. It had happened before. Today, though, luck was on his side. He made it out the door and into the parking garage. Inside his car, he tore off his tie and unbuttoned his collar. Then he typed his address into the car's auto-drive system and waited as the onboard computer took him home. He wasn't quite sure how he felt about his car, or even self-driving cars in general. Sure, they were said to be safer than if a person were behind the wheel, but getting into a car that didn't even have wheels still gave him pause. On the other hand, he was able to catch a quick nap while the car navigated through the evening rush hour. So he wasn't as completely set against the idea as some people he knew. The only reason he had to dislike the car at all was that it was a company car, which wasn't so bad until he realized that he'd missed some sort of unspoken agreement. All the time he gained by letting the car do its thing needed to be spent on additional productivity beyond office hours. If he was honest with himself, he'd admit that he'd come to hate the car over tax season. Part of the reason he'd chosen to stay at the office rather than return home was that it was easier to deal with overtime at work in his tiny, cramped cubicle than to do so while experiencing the joys of stop-and-go traffic at the same time. Once home, he rushed to the dresser and changed into a snug pair of ratty jeans and a Led Zeppelin t-shirt. The suit and tie lay at the foot of his bed. Today he was going to kick off the weekend in style. 7 hours later, he stumbled out of his favorite bar and back to his car. He'd had just enough presence of mind to buckle up and type in his destination before darkness clouded his vision and he passed out in his seat. He woke up the next morning to a scraping on the car's window. He struggled ineffectually to hit his alarm clock until he was awake enough to realize 2 things: that there was no alarm clock, and that there should not be a golden stag running its antlers across the window and hood. For almost a minute he stared, unblinking. Then he screamed and tried to bolt from his seat, which was cut short by the seatbelt tensing and forcing him back down. The stag flicked its ears and cocked its head to the side. Then it looked off into the distance before darting into the trees. It only took a couple of seconds for the sight of trees to penetrate his hangover. When it did, he groaned. His apartment wasn't anywhere near a forest, and if the dirt road and densely packed pine trees were any indication, he wasn't anywhere near his apartment. He rubbed his eyes. All of the screens were black. Even the digital clock was out. He tried the key. Nothing happened. The battery must have died, but that didn't make any sense. The last time he checked the charge wasn't that long ago. He'd had at least another 100 miles before he needed to plug it in again. He pulled his cell out. It wasn't dead yet, but searching for a signal was draining it fast. Only a single bar of power remained. Stepping out of the car, he was glad for at least this bit of luck. He wasn't sure what he would have done if he was trapped inside because of an unresponsive electronic lock while stuck in the middle of nowhere. He popped the hood and looked at the engine. It felt like the right thing to do, even if his understanding of how an electrical engine ran was only eclipsed by his non-existent knowledge of nanobiotics. After a couple of seconds he spent staring at the mass of metal, he slammed the hood shut and rubbed his temples. "Could this get any worse?" he mumbled. Off in the distance, a rhythmic clash of metal on metal started to draw closer. He hadn't noticed it before. Now that he did, A sudden panicked urge to run gripped him before he fought it down and waited, leaning against the car. When the first column of tin soldiers marched into view and leveled gleaming pikes while spreading out to surround him, he regretted not fleeing while he had the chance. Oh boy,